Hello, welcome back. Thank you for being prompt. Just before we start this debate, I just need to ask everybody to make sure that you've signed up to the breakout session this afternoon. It's due to take place at 3:15. You've got three options, and we really need you all to sign up. I think quite a few people haven't. So if you can go to the app, please, and then select Agenda, and then you will be given three options for those three breakout sessions. If you can just pick one, it's really important that you do, and then we'll know whether we've got the right capacity in the right rooms. Right, so this is the first panel discussion of the conference, and we begin in what's probably a rather obvious and necessary place by defining what we mean by beyond compliance. Suggesting that a company should do more than it needs to do might not make real sense to some executives, I suppose. They already view ever-expanding financial and trade regulations as rather unwelcome. And if compliance is a perpetual drain on a business, is there really any point in doing more than you absolutely have to meet basic regulatory requirements? For organisations that say, let's just do the basics, are they really saying, let's not bother growing, let's not bother innovating or developing? But in some cases, the demands of the social licence that need to meet the expectations of society might be tougher than any regulation that any government could come up with. To try and help us reach a definition and answer some of the questions that we're hopefully going to have posed by you, we're joined by four panellists. I've got really detailed explanations of who they all are, and they don't like them. Professor Steve Evans was the first to object. He's a serial green tech entrepreneur and very proudly told me that he's lost £1 million 3 times. So don't trust a word he says, he says. He also has another accolade to his name. He's from Cambridge University and has acted as a special advisor to the House of Lords and a member of the lead expert group for the government's future of manufacturing foresight exercise. No wonder he didn't want me to read that out. Professor Genevieve LeBaron, or Genevieve LeBaron, depending on whether she's here or in Canada. She is a professor of politics at the University of Sheffield. She's also co-chair of the Yale University Modern Slavery Working Group. She's an award-winning researcher, author, educator on the business models of forced labour. Avedis Sefarian is president and CEO of WRAP, which stands for you know me and my acronyms, Worldwide Responsible Accredited Production, which makes more sense to me. He has extensive knowledge of social responsibility issues within the highly complex worldwide supply chains of the apparel, textile and footwear sectors. There's much more to him than that, but we'll find that out later when we network with him. Wesley Wilson is vice chair of the board of directors of APSCA. His focus is very much on the positive social and environmental effects of economic growth. He led strategy for social impact across Walmart's global supply chains, managing a team with expertise in human rights, collaboration and design to define strategies and build key partnerships with government, civil society and other companies. And the final panellist just wants to be known as Marco Baren of Philips. Apparently that's all you need to know. He's just an ordinary guy. Really? Okay. There you go. Somebody's moved the slide on for me. Thank you very much. So we will hear from each of the speakers for about 10 minutes, or maybe only 3 in Marco's case. And then they'll take a few questions from me, but mostly from you, and we'll have the roving microphone. So please don't be shy. I'll have some extra questions up my sleeve if we absolutely need them, but it's much more important than you get to ask these experts a few questions. So firstly, Steve, come and see how much money you can lose.
Good morning, everyone. Is it still morning? It's getting close. I'm a serial gloom merchant. I could have joined in this morning's conversation about how bad things have been in the past and how bad things are in the future if we don't sort it out. Those of us who live in the world that we live in get used to this. You know, our friends avoid us. They don't invite us to parties anymore. I would like to slightly change that tone. I think we're talking about beyond compliance because you've done such an absolutely bloody brilliant job so far. there are people today who are not going to die because of the work of the people in this room. Thank you. And they should blink and thank you, and I hope they send you a letter. I used to work for a company called Martin Baker Engineering. We made 95% of the free world's ejection seats. Twice a week we got a letter saying, thank you for saving my life. If you've ever ejected, hands up, from a fast jet traveling at 1,000 kilometers an hour, you remember to write a thank you letter. How many instances of avoided death? People don't know, right? But we know statistically how fantastic we've done. But it isn't enough, people. And the conversation today is about what happens if you've been really good at the job to the point where you're beginning to make yourself look redundant and expensive. Right? Sorry about that. But you are. And it's because of your success. So what happens next? What do we mean by beyond compliance? And I'm going to offer some reasoning why this is happening at the moment. I think there's a principle at stake. Compliance is based on a very specific mental model which has been offered already by Martine, which is the assumption that maximum profit is somehow in the world of non-compliance, and that compliance is only going to reduce the profit of both supplier and customer. This leads to very particular mental models, cultures, behaviors, and systems which enshrine a lose-lose system and performance, I'm afraid. And if you want to move to a world where the customers and the suppliers in the relationship are both winning, the famous win-win, then compliance thinking is actually one of the hurdles that you have to get around. And I think we'll hear more about that today. Why are we doing compliance? We're trying to stop bad things happening. If that is the way that you design a system, how do you design the same system to make good things happen? It's actually really challenging. You're experts at that. But it's just trying to turn a donkey into a horse at times, right? It's really hard work. And I think we might have to go back to first principles if we're going to meet this new purpose which appears to be in front of us at the moment. In my work, I travel around the globe helping companies become more sustainable, whatever that means, and it's open to interpretation. Everybody's got their own view in the room, and ordinary companies all over the place have their own view of what sustainable means for them. I work in all sorts of different sectors, and the message is really clear. People are beginning to be frustrated by the cost of compliance and the lack of forward performance enhancement, of a system that helps them get better as opposed to less bad. And that frustration is felt now. I work with maybe some of the pioneer thinking organizations. You'd imagine in my job that would be true. I think it's probably true. But I don't think that the people that we work with are lone figures out on a fringe. They're just very early on in a particular trend, and that trend is coming. And I'm very sure, having spoken to the other speakers, they're going to say, it's happening, the trend is coming, the wave is coming of beyond compliance. That's what people want. How do we deliver it? Starts to become more interesting. What else is changing? We've heard of technology changing. Social media changes everything. I'm working with an incredibly large retailer. There's only about 4 that you can guess from once you've made that statement, right? And looking at all of their suppliers in China. And we're looking at how you use social media to better understand the lives and the safety and the health of the people who work there. I hope that scares you. That's like, oh, hang on a minute, we're going to use WeChat to get round you lot, right? That's just what technology is doing on its own. Our knowledge is changing, knowledge about what works and what doesn't work. I work with a global company that makes things like ice creams. That's a really good company to work for, by the way. And if you go to an ice cream factory in Indonesia and an ice cream factory in the UK, they're using the same equipment and they're following the same written down procedures. One of them uses 10 times more water than the other one. You think, ooh, that's interesting. But the other one uses half the energy of the one that uses 10% of the water. The sharing of best practice between those places has become an ever-increasing urgent issue for manufacturers, the sort of people that I work with. So you're seeing technology coming into place that is a sort of combination of cool technology and social media. You'll see an example if you go to the hall and listen tomorrow from 2 Degrees with their Manufacturing 2030 mechanism, trying to get people to anonymously and safely share information about best practices. I think that the risk appetite of organizations is changing. They realize that if they stay still, and it's already been mentioned this morning, if you stay still, the system, your competitors, the newbies are going to overtake you. So you are the one who has the resources to invest in being different. Are you doing that? And that's the question of the larger companies. Luckily, we work with the good ones. For example, how are people going beyond compliance? I do a lot of work with a company called Toyota. You may have heard of them. They're quite good at making things. They're the manufacturer's manufacturer. They're the one we all look up to. And if you go to the factory in Derby, it is the world's best place to look at energy-efficient manufacture of anything. Every year, they reduce the energy it takes to make a car by 8%. They've been doing that for 14 years. We can now make 4 cars for the energy it used to take to make 1. We haven't spent millions of dollars to achieve that. Efficiency is about sharing the knowledge of the people, not just within the factory, but across factories. We have to learn how to do that. Is one of your compliance questions, what is your annual long-run improvement? It should be 8% in energy. If we can get on that pathway across all of our suppliers, we are not just saving lives, we're saving the planet. You can fill in the gap, right? A lot of the work that we do is in what we call value innovation, business model innovation. Companies come to us and say, the way we're doing business is a bit of a challenge. Can we alter the relationship we have with our customers? You can see from the Walmart presentation, they're thinking, what does that mean to be a retailer in the 21st century? And they're bringing trust in. Well, I think the change is going to be much bigger than that. It is 5 times more profitable not to sell a car. It is 5 times more profitable not to sell the shirt. But the dominant retailing mechanism is to sell cars and sell shirts, and they're stuck in that trap. It's 5 times more profitable. They need to find those innovations. And the companies that we're working with, the last message I want to leave you with is they're experimenting. They're trying new ideas. And they're trying those new ideas in a world that is quite separated from the world of compliance. And I would encourage you to engage in those experiments and join in those experiments, if at all possible. We were encouraged to find bolt cutters earlier, which is quite a scary thought. For those of us who have been building safety barriers and safety equipment and helping save lives, just that mental image of carrying bolt cutters is quite scary. We have to learn to be incredibly safe experimenters with bolt cutters. And I will leave you with that image. Thank you.
Have you got something? Yeah.
Well, we'll just wait and hope that the slides come up. Anyhow, thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to be here. Jonathan mentioned modern slavery this morning, and I just want to start by asking you a few questions, which I'd like you to answer with a show of hands. How many of you feel concerned about the problem of modern slavery?
If they've got signs.
It's a lot of people. How many of you have ever felt worried about the possibility that modern slavery could be found in your supply chain or in an industry that you source from or work within? Yeah, so this is a real problem. How many of you have been involved in some kind of effort to prevent or address modern slavery in the global economy? Great. I'm with you. I'm worried about modern slavery too. I worry about the fact that in 2016, there were almost 25 million people subjected to forced labor in the private economy, according to the International Labour Organization. And I'm pleased to see governments taking action to address the problem and to try to even the playing field for businesses who are working hard to do the right thing. But I also sometimes worry that we're acting without yet having an in-depth understanding of the problem. Because the reality is, we still know very little about the business of forced labor. We don't really know how perpetrators make money from it. We don't have a good understanding of how and why it enters into legitimate supply chains, why it's more common in some portion of the supply chain than others, why it tends to be used within some organizations and not others. And while we're learning more and more about this all the time, the reality is we're combating modern slavery in business based on a pretty thin evidence base. Most of the research that is out there has been conducted by advocacy organizations who have a vested interest in portraying the problem in a certain light and in ways that generate a lot of attention to the issue. And no doubt this has been hugely helpful in terms of raising awareness that modern slavery is a problem that we need to confront. But as far as business is concerned, it's meant that where business dynamics have been investigated, the focus has usually been on these big companies at the top of the supply chain, those with brands who are well known to consumers. And that's meant that we have a very thin understanding of the much smaller and often very informal organizations and intermediaries that actually perpetrate forced labor on the ground. If we had a better understanding of the problem, informed by independent research, it would be a lot easier to go beyond compliance to address and prevent modern slavery in global supply chains. There you go. Cool, thank you. Oh, there's my website. Okay, so I'm an academic. I teach politics at the University of Sheffield here in the UK. And for the last several years, I've been studying the global business of forced labor. My latest project, which I've been working on for about 3 years now, focuses on cocoa and tea supply chains, and I've been asked to share that research with you here today. So I'll give you just a really quick overview of the project. I've been interested in two things. The first is in understanding forced labor and how it operates within cocoa and tea supply chains. And the second is understanding the effectiveness of prevailing initiatives to address it, such as ethical certification and auditing. Essentially asking, under what circumstances are these effective in relation to forced labor? So putting aside all of the other areas where there's a lot more data about effectiveness, to just look and really zero in on forced labor. So to investigate these questions, I've led an international research team to collect an original data set. And we started at the bottom of the supply chain, conducting interviews with 122 workers, and then we did a survey of about 1,000 cocoa and tea workers to try to understand when, why, and how they have become vulnerable to forced labor when it occurs, and what it looks like in those industries. And we then traced up the supply chain all the way to the top, interviewing domestic business actors, international business actors, and various experts along the way. And what we're trying to understand are the business pressures and challenges that each of these actors are under, and trying to understand how this paradox could occur, that, on the one hand, in our review at the beginning of the project, we found really rigorous policies and practices around forced labor. But then when we drilled down into the supply chain, we still found that this was a big problem on the ground. So we're trying to understand that disjuncture. The first thing to say about the study and the findings is that it's not a name and shame study. You can all breathe a big sigh of relief. The data is anonymized. It's not a study of specific companies, supply chains, or practices. This is a study about patterns. In our survey, we've done random selection of plantations and cocoa communities because we're trying to understand how businesses of different size, ownership structures, product destinations, covered under different types of ethical certification schemes and standards, what the variation is across those sites. And again, the goal is to understand the business of forced labor on the ground and effectiveness questions. So I'll just share the findings really briefly and schematically for the sake of time. I'm going to focus on the theme of our panel here today, which is beyond compliance. I'll be publishing a report later this spring that will go into a lot greater depth and nuance about the findings, and I'd be happy to share that with anyone who's interested. I'll start with the bad news first, get it out of the way. The bad news is that our research suggests that compliance approaches are not working very well in terms of detecting and addressing forced labor and exploitation in these particular supply chains. There is some variation across sites and across schemes, but overall, the worker survey and interviews that we did unearthed a lot of bad news for both auditing and certification schemes. Some of the worst cases of forced labor that we encountered took place on work sites that were covered under some of the most well-respected certification schemes and standards. And again, I unfortunately don't have time to go into detail on this, but overall, I think the data begs a lot of questions about some of those schemes. Part of the problem here that we're dealing with is that in some portions of these industries, again, not all portions, but in some geographic areas where cocoa and tea come from, forced labor and labor abuse more generally are pretty endemic business practices. I think it would be hard to source from some of these areas that we looked at without running into the problem of forced labor. It has to do with prices, it has to do with rising costs of energy and other production costs, but it also has to do with the history of bonded labor within these industries, histories that stretch back many hundreds of years, and as well as the poverty and immobility of local populations. It's really complicated, but for many reasons, forced labor can be pretty hard to avoid in some of these portions of these subtiers of these supply chains. And right now, there's a lot of monitoring of that situation, but there seems to be very little concrete action to actually address these systemic problems. And it can be quite misleading, I think, to put certification stamps on products that come from these areas where exploitation is endemic, which is calling into question the rigor of some of these standards. So I think that's something we need to think really carefully about. The final piece of bad news that really surprised me within the research was that we discovered that some certification schemes actually leave out the most vulnerable workers within these chains. So for instance, we know in cocoa that day laborers are very vulnerable, but they aren't encompassed within the remit of some of the schemes which tend to focus on the farmer, for instance, not the people that the farmer hired. So there are gaps in terms of the kind of problem of forced labor and then a mismatch with some of the systems designed to detect and address it. We found that this approach, the compliance approach, can also have some perverse effects. It can create pressures, for instance, to hide bad practices. And we found that a ramping up of compliance efforts in one industry, say cocoa, might be displacing the problem of forced labor to other industries. So for instance, we heard a lot about how forced labor was shifting from cocoa to gold mining, for instance, in some of the areas that we looked at. Okay, so that's all the bad news. The good news within our study is that businesses are becoming a lot more well-informed on these topics. And I think that there is a real readiness for concerted action. There are real opportunities for all types of businesses to create change in this area and to go beyond compliance and to develop tools and solutions that are fit for the purpose of addressing forced labor. There's also a real opportunity, I think, now that we are understanding more about the root causes of these problems, to go deeper and to tackle root causes. Companies are beginning to take such steps, both in terms of how they're looking at their own practices, and sometimes the disconnect between programs like certification on the one hand, and then their own purchasing practices on the other. And they're developing, and they're thinking about how that disconnect could fuel demand for bad labor practices at some deep parts of the supply chain. And companies are also looking at root causes in terms of thinking more about workers' vulnerability. So that's really positive. Finally, our research underscores the importance and opportunity of involving workers as solutions to the problem of forced labor. Our research found that workers are a powerful resource and ally in addressing this problem. But currently, they're quite marginalized within many industry compliance initiatives. We found that where workers are meaningfully included in the process and in solutions, those solutions are much more likely to be successful. So to me, going beyond compliance means taking research and data seriously. It means grappling with the reality that some of our sort of steadfast, commonly used tools aren't working very well for this particular problem and challenge of modern slavery. And so there's a need to diversify and develop more effective, responsible approaches, which I'll look forward to chatting with you all about over the next 2 days. Thank you.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. So here we are at the Sedex 2018 conference, and our theme is Beyond Compliance. If the Sedex conference and talking about beyond compliance is not in your travel plans, now's a good time to head for the exits. I was asked to be up to the daunting task of participating on a panel that is going to be defining beyond compliance. And I was quite trepidatious to accept, to be honest with you, because I'm not entirely sure I have a good answer. But I figured it's not the first panel of the day. I'm not even the first speaker on the panel. There are all these great speakers ahead of me. They'll say smart things. I'll learn something, and I'll be able to, sound like I know what I'm talking about. I'm a lawyer, after all. So having been sat there all morning and listening to Martine and Jonathan and Sally and Tom and Steve and Genevieve, nice to have a little rhyme in there in the land of Shakespeare here. After listening to all these great speakers, I got to tell you, I still don't know what beyond compliance is about. Fortunately, however, the panel has been asked to define in terms of what it means to you. So there's a nice little pass built in for all of us to say, we can't trust you to tell us what it means for everybody. You're not that smart, but just tell us what it means for you. So here's what it means for me, or at least here's my hopefully not too rambling attempt to, on my feet, figure out what it means for me. You see, those of us who've been doing this for a good long time have learned a thing or two, mostly what doesn't work, and from there try to extrapolate to get us into what does work. And some of us, like my good friend Jonathan, are finding our patience running a little low, which I fear for you, Jonathan. This space needs a lot of patience, but hopefully the progress that you are seeing and you are yourself driving at Sedex will be enough to feed your soul and not let your impatience overwhelm you. But here's the thing. When I get asked, or when I hear people talk about beyond compliance, and sort of, this isn't work, we gotta talk about the next thing, I worry because it sounds to me like there's an underlying assumption, one of two assumptions, that either we've done compliance, we got that covered, which I heard sort of in Steve's presentation. Now we got to go to the next thing. So we've solved the problem. Now let's evolve to the next thing. Or it doesn't work, which is what I heard in Genevieve's presentation. So we've got to go beyond it because this thing's broken. It is not worth carrying on. And I would submit that both of those are simultaneously true and not true. In other words, I don't think that we should be talking about beyond compliance because we've got it licked. Compliance is now part and parcel of our lives. We've got that sorted out. On to the next best thing. I don't think so, because quite frankly, being in this business, I can tell you it isn't done. There's still an awful lot of work to be done just at that basic compliance level. And quite frankly, I don't think one is profitably able to move on to the next step without first mastering the basic step. You simply cannot run without first learning to walk. Yet on the other hand, I also do not hold with those who believe that compliance is broken, and irredeemably so. In other words, we must go beyond compliance because compliance just isn't cutting it. It's not getting us anywhere. We've got to abandon this whole ideology that we've built up over the last couple of decades and figure out from scratch a better way of doing things. I don't hold with that either because quite irrefutably, we have seen the benefits that compliance has brought to this space. Jonathan mentioned a bunch of statistics, and the one that I am particularly proud of for the compliance space is the reduction in the child labor numbers over the past decade. And there's been immense strides forward made in worker safety and health, and even in the environmental area, where we continue to have a lot of challenges in front of us. Things are unquestionably better today than they were 10 years ago. So what then is my take on what the conversation ought to be about? For me, and again to shamelessly steal from Jonathan's presentation, the Colin Powell quote, different context as he pointed out, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, I tend to actually hold with in most contexts. But what is important about that quote is the subtext. If it is broken, you absolutely have to fix it. So a part of the discussion has to be, how do we address the issues that compliance is not handling well? But another part of the conversation also has to, and I suppose it's the same conversation really from a different angle, has to start by saying, what are we getting right? How can we build on that? So, to me, the real conversation isn't so much beyond compliance and the implication therein that one way or the other, you're leaving compliance behind and moving ahead somehow, but rather it is one of rethink compliance. It is definitely a mind shift, and it does involve all kinds of systemic change, which does indeed, as Sally told us, begin from within. But truly, to me, getting it right means learning from where we've been, seeing what we've done right and what we've done wrong, and when we move ahead, it's not beyond compliance, it is simply an evolution of compliance, rethinking it, recognizing it for its role, right? And I think, again, I heard from Genevieve's presentation that audits and certifications have a role to play. And to me, they will always continue to have a role to play. I think the problem, and perhaps where the folks that are in the camp that hold that compliance has failed and is irredeemably unhelpful, I think the problem with the reason why they conclude that is because they ascribe to compliance, to audits and certifications, expectations that are unfair to place on that particular activity. It has a role to play, but audits, certification itself is never going to solve the problem on its own. So beyond compliance, the rethinking of compliance means understanding the role it has to play. And for me, I've always I picked up this Chinese proverb a few years ago. Those of you who have heard me speak have heard me say this lots of times, but I always use it because it is so evocative. You do not fatten a pig by weighing it. You do not fatten a pig by weighing it. The act of weighing the pig doesn't actually make it any fatter. You got to feed the pig to make it fat. But you absolutely have to weigh the pig as well to know how fat it's gotten. Right? How will you know when it is at optimal fatness? Can I butcher the English language here in London? Is that okay? If you don't weigh it. Similarly, now, and let me finish that thought. But weighing it isn't what's making it fat. You have to feed it to make it fat. So similarly, that to me is the right thinking when it comes to what's the evolutionary space we ought to be in when we regard compliance. You are going to always need audits and certification. You're going to always need that diagnostic tool, the weighing tool. right? Because how do you get there if you don't know where here is? How do you go beyond if you don't know where you're starting from? So you're always going to need that diagnostic tool. You're always going to need audits and certifications, but do not expect that to solve your problems. That is merely the base on which solutions have to be built. And that, to me, is the right way to think about beyond compliance. It is a rethinking. It is not an abandoning. It is not a, we're done, time to move on to the next thing. Neither of those are appropriate in my mind. I realize I'm contradicting two academicians, and I have to sit next to them now. But to me, the right way of thinking it is take what you have, build on it, recognize it for what it does give you, and do not blind yourself to the things that it does not. Then you can think of compliance in a new light, which, as I said, I would cast more as rethink compliance and not simply beyond compliance as the implication one way or the other of abandoning it either because it's done what it's supposed to or it has completely failed. With that, I will thank you for your time. I appreciate it, and I look forward to the questions.
All right, good afternoon. Let's see, let's just go to the next slide, or is it that one? All right, I have the opportunity to represent APSCA today, and excited to be on a panel, to be participating as part of this. Panels are always fun because you think you know what you're going to say, and then the other speakers start speaking, and then you realize you have Marco after you, and you kind of, you sit there, you end up, you revise your remarks and really kind of put things in a different perspective. And so I'll be kind of citing the other speakers here. Really kind of interesting so far, and my objective is to let's go ahead and get the discussion started, because after all, lunch is just around the corner. So first, this feeling of impatience. I think we are a room full of impatient people. Most of the people that I know that work in this space are impatient people. And so I identify with that. And so there's an understanding of what has come before, but then there's also this expectation of the future and the way that things can be better. We're always looking at how things can be better because we do work that matters. We know that we do work that matters. We identify with that work and understand that work. And so we're always looking to push the envelope and always doing so with that sense of impatience. But like some of the other speakers, Steve and Avedis, I would urge you to just stop and recognize whenever you feel that feeling of impatience and that you want to push the envelope forward, stop and look back and recognize what has been accomplished, what has been done, what has been achieved, and realize that you are building on something. So on the plane ride over, let's see, is that slide coming up? No, it is not. So I'll just talk to it anyway. So on the plane ride over, was trying to think about, okay, the same question Avedis was talking about. Other way, there we go. There we go. So on the plane ride over, I was wrestling with the same question of, okay, gosh, beyond compliance, what a big topic, what a complicated topic, how do I even talk to it? I opened my copy of Harvard Business Review and hit this article and know that someone somewhere in the world is looking out for me. So had that very good fortune. But in all seriousness, so in this month's Harvard Business Review, take a look at this article, because this is really important for the conversation that we're having today. And the reason it's important is that it highlights that we are actually and have been having a discussion in social compliance that other parts of the compliance space are just now getting to. And so we have been grappling with a set of things. We've been grappling with a set of questions. We've been talking about them for some time. We've been talking about the solutions to them for some time that other parts of compliance are just now getting to today. And so a very interesting perspective from this article. And I think the key thing that this left me with that I'll share with you today is, listen, there's a ton of brilliant innovation happening in our space. But there are a set of things that we have to think about as part of our industry and as part of what we do that we have to change or we have to improve, or the new things will look a lot like the old things. And so those are the three things that I would like to touch on today. So first, I believe that public-private collaboration is absolutely essential to what we do. Those of you that know me know that my career, I've had the good fortune to span both the public sector and the private sector. Governments make lousy companies, and companies make lousy governments. And there is a role for both of them in the compliance world, in the social impact and compliance work that we do. There are laws needed. There's the innovation and push needed by the private sector, but you have to have both. My feeling, having worked in this space for a few years, is that companies tend to neglect the public policy side of our conversation. And it's absolutely essential not only to drive compliance in our own organizations and with our partners, but also be advocating back to the governments that we work with in different spaces to actually help them to up their game and shape the frameworks that we work with. So Steve talked about shaping those systems to make good things happen. Companies and governments have to work together in order to shape those systems to make good things happen. And that really is, whether it's compliance or beyond compliance, that really is the end of what we are doing. Second, professionalism. I think that this is where APSCA comes in. I've had the privilege of working with APSCA in this iteration since it's begun, and really excited for the opportunities that it brings to help professionalize the field. I think overall, it is a challenge that in different roles that I've had, I frequently face, is sometimes the professionalism that is needed in this field isn't there and isn't at the level that's needed to interface with major corporations. It's lacking. And so to the degree which we can up our professionalism, to the degree which we can hold ourselves to a higher standard, to the degree which we can recognize those competencies and elevate them, it's absolutely essential, not only for our own practice, but to have the practice that we work on recognized by others. Lastly, measurement, and in particular precision in measurement, and what gets measured gets managed. And I don't use measurement lightly. Measurement comes with cost, but you do have to measure, and you do have to take the time, as Genevieve was saying, the time to look at the data, the time to understand data, the time to be rigorous behind data. I think too often we look at the latest kind of silver bullet, or we look at the latest set of things, and we try to formulate a response off it. We really don't understand it. We just keep moving. Again, nothing wrong with moving quickly, but I think there is a miss, or there's a lack of really looking at data with rigor and figuring out where to measure and how to measure with precision so that we can measure the improvements that are taking place. I think a lot of times the improvement that comes from the social compliance space doesn't get recognized because we simply have not put the time and attention and investment into measuring it. And so I would just leave you with those three things for discussion for the rest of this panel, but then also the conference. Think about how these three things apply to the different conversations that we'll be having over the next 2 days. Again, there's been a lot accomplished, but unless we improve some of the things that we do, where we're headed and the innovation that we see and the places that we have the opportunity to go, some of it has the risk to look like the past and not kind of jumping into the future unless we address some of these things. So thank you. Look forward to more discussion and questions.
Thank you, Wesley. Thank you, all of you. I'm the last one. I have to admit I learned something. What I learned is that I can say to my wife that bonded labor is not telling her to do what I have to do. Yeah? So it's not that anymore. So if she is telling me do this and that, that's no bonded labor. So Philips, what did we do? I like to keep this very, very short because all is almost said. But we moved on. And I like you to also move on. Tomorrow I have a presentation, and that presentation is in the late afternoon. I hope you're still here. And for those who are part of or even owning a auditing company, I've got bad news for you. If you keep doing what you're doing at this moment in time, you will be disrupted very fast, because we stopped auditing as of 2016. And there's no such company working for us anymore. There are companies working for us who moved on, who thought, hey, there must be something else in there. And that something else is going to a supplier, working with that supplier, teaming up with that supplier, and helping that supplier to improve. And what we're not doing is going there with my beautiful white nose, telling them what to do. I first listen to them. What is their problems? What are they fighting with? Why don't we listen to them? Why are we telling them, and thou will have only 60 hours a week? Not working. So listen, talk to them. We have discovered, so I will take this sentence and tomorrow I repeat it, but we have done 2,500 audits in our silly company. Yeah? And to be honest, looking back, it's a good foundation. So the first word I'm giving to you, thank you. Thank you, and I'm doing the same as Steve did. Thank you for what you have done in the past. Don't keep doing it. It will not be good enough anymore. But thank you for the basis. We've got a good foundation. We've got a very, very good code which we can refer to. But there's more, much more. The second part is, and I'm going to ask you a very simple question. If you have suppliers in your environment, how many of those suppliers do comply? We went there. We had zero tolerances. Everything was okay, yeah? At least my third party went there. Now we're doing it ourselves. And to be honest, it is a shocking result. Really, really shocking if you think everything is okay. So give me a figure. What do you think, what is our zero tolerance? I'm talking about child labor. I'm talking about falsified records, about everything can go wrong. Yeah? What is the percentage we find of those we did? And we did last year 250. Yeah? It's not a lot, but it's a start. Is it more or less than 10%? Who's going for more? More than 10%? Not a lot. Who's going for more than 20%? All right. Who's going for more than, let's say, 40%? Thank you, you can do my speech. Come. It's 45%. Take or leave. So in those cases, we find real wrong stuff. And the first thing we do, and there I'm with you, so sorry, a difficult name for me, yeah?
Avedis.
Avedis. So I'm with Avedis. First, fix the system. Fix the roots, fix the foundation. After that, you can build. If there's no foundation, everything goes woof down, yeah? But I'm also with Steve. Once you have fixed that, help them to improve. That's what we do. Don't leave it up to them. First of all, why should they, yeah? Pass-fail mentality. If I pass that audit and I don't fail, I'm good. Leave me alone, yeah? Does not work. Will never work. So please think about how that will be in the future. I will stop now because tomorrow there's more and I will have tons of slides which you can take home if you want them. What we're doing, and then I stop, is really cool. We're thinking about tomorrow and what are we going to do about it, how we are going to use big data, how we are going to use all that stuff. And is that the real stuff we need, or is it something else? And I will teach you tomorrow, I will learn what we're doing, that there's more. There's something else which you want to have. real insightful data, real insightful graphs. I will have tons of stuff with me. I will stop here, and I see everybody's quiet and thinks this Marco guy is crazy. I am. It starts with you. If you want to change, make it happen. And if you can change and you have the mandate in your company, do it. But don't wait. Because others will be faster than you are. And then you're looking behind, they are looking in the rear of your mirror, and you're looking in front, and that is very difficult. Huh? All right, I will sit down. I'll give it back to you.
Thank you. So we've got about 15, 20 minutes. I think we can stretch it a bit. We'll be late for lunch.
Thank you.
Just eat quickly. We're going to have some roving microphones in just a moment because I do want to open it up to the floor. But I do have one question that I want everyone to answer. We'll start with Marco. It goes back to the title, really. Whether you like compliance, whether you think it's working or not, what does beyond compliance look like to you, Marco, in terms of what are you aiming for at Philips in going beyond compliance?
One word only, improving. One word only,
improving
no more.
What? But
I want to improve the situation that I find I'm responsible for my supply base at the suppliers. So that's one. And that can be as broad as it can be. It can be that the local environment in that factory is not really healthy, then that's the first thing to do. It can be that they are already on a decent level, but I still want them to improve. And that goes along, we have 5 pillars, here we have 4 pillars, but we have got 5 pillars. And
what's your 5th pillar?
Well, it's the management systems around that. So it's environment and the management system. So we look to all of them. And they have to push the envelope, like Wesley said, to all of them. But I don't want them to push them at the same time. They have to focus. So make your pick. What you can do, please do. Don't do what you cannot do, and then build on that.
I said I had one question. I lied.
Please.
I have another one. If you're not going to audit, how do you know you've improved?
Good question. That's a long story. I will keep it short. The process is I'm going to a supplier telling them there's no more penalty if you're not. So I'm going to train them. They're coming to me. In our environment, I'm going to tell them there's no penalty if you're not compliant with the code. Just show me your naked self, and I will tell you whether I see something that is really not good, and I will help you getting there. So back to the second step, that is a self-assessment questionnaire. I didn't believe in that, but tomorrow will be more details about it. So there we'll do some self-assessment. After that, I'm going there with my own team for 3 days on the site, helping them to improve. So it's an improvement program, listening to them and seeing where they can improve. So it's not a neutral audit anymore. We've got all the data, all the information, and there's no punishment.
Wesley, can you add to that? What for you would going beyond compliance look like? Yeah. What would success be?
I mean, I'll actually borrow from Steve. I think it is your kind of quip or your quote about designing the system or changing the system to make good things happen. To me, that's what beyond compliance looks like. And so it's thinking about the system, it's thinking about the incentive structures that people work with and work under, and looking to understand those so that then you can actually not only try to push individuals in the right direction, but change the system so that you actually do see those good things happen.
But what's the outcome for people and the environment?
Well, I think if the system is making good things happen, that if you're changing the system to make good things happen, then I think there are fewer kind of negative social and environmental consequences, and frankly even positive social and environmental consequences. Business has and does all the time have a good social and environmental impact, generate social and environmental good. And so the question is, what are the incentives, and are the incentives pushing businesses to create not only financial wealth, but then wealth of other types, not only financial wealth, and are there incentives that can encourage businesses potentially to cut corners?
Avedis, can you add to it?
Well, Martine, if the question is what does it look like, I'll tell you I have no idea. I don't know what it's going to look like. But I'll tell you what I think the end result ought to be, and that is simply that we stop talking about what it looks like. It just becomes part and parcel of how we do things every day. I think that was step number 10 in that little infographic that Jonathan had. I keep going back to his speeches. Where sustainable business becomes a part of the everyday life. I think that's what we need to get to. I think we're not there, and it'll take a while to get there. And along the way, we have to do all the things that Marco and Wesley mentioned, and Steve and Genevieve as well. But the end product has to be just an integration into our daily thing. And the example I always use, going back to what Steve said about Toyota, is quality in manufacturing is no longer thought of as a separate discussion point, right? It's part and parcel of the process, but that wasn't always the case, right? There used to be, a while ago now, half a century or more ago, that manufacturing was a process that was done. It went through however many number of steps it had to go through, and quality was only looked at the end of the process, until the good folks at Toyota gave us TQM and the like, recognizing that to manage that well, it has to be done throughout. And now we're at the point where manufacturing is not a process that is discussed independent of quality. It's baked into it. So that's what we need to get to with regards to social responsibility and sustainability and all these good things that we're talking about. That's the end goal, to make it integrated into the way we do business. So we're not actually having a separate conversation. We're not having a themed event on this issue because it's part of doing it every day. That's what the end looks like.
But Genevieve, part of doing it every day doesn't necessarily generate the results you might want to see. What would you want to see for the people that you go and collect data with and from?
Yeah, I think those are all great points. I actually, in a sense, I do think that's an important point. If the way the whole business operates integrates some risks and creates risks around things like modern slavery, then adding on a compliance program, isn't going to solve that. It's sort of you're undermining your own work. So I think that's an important point. The thing I would just add, I guess, is that modern slavery is a quite specific issue, and it's a lot of businesses are quite new in terms of trying to grapple with that particular issue. And I think we need to do so with tools that are fit for purpose. I think one thing I saw in my research was that there's a sort of adding on of forced labor to existing programs, and that those programs may be very well set up to deal with products and to deal with environmental issues, technical issues, but they're not necessarily very well built to deal with an issue that is as difficult to detect and deal with as modern slavery. And so I think that we really need to be making sure that we're optimizing these programs and using them in ways that make sense for the problem that we're trying to resolve. What I'd like to see, obviously, are organizations coming together by sector and dealing with problems at a more systemic level, because I think our research shows very much that we need to tackle root causes and not just sort of, drive forward these compliance issues that may have perverse effects that actually kind of reinforce the problem. And so that's what strikes me.
I think, the nirvana here is that people internalize. That at the moment we're bringing a message from the outside and saying, will you please behave in a way? And there are a number of ways in which we could potentially internalize these performance characteristics that we're interested in. That's very technical academic jargon, isn't it? But I was lucky enough to be seconded out of university to be one of the directors of supply chain development for Nissan in Europe. We measured our suppliers on continuous self-improvement. That's the one KPI. You keep improving yourself. It's not about us knocking on your door. We will come and run those exercises. You almost described some of what I did when I was working for Nissan. We came in and helped you, but it was because you opened the door and said, please, Nissan, you have some knowledge. Please help us. They were in control of the improvement process. We must reach that point where they're in control. And I think that then it goes away from auditing towards more measurement. There is still a lot of measurement happening and a lot of really clever measurement, right? What I would really like is for people to build in sustainability into their strategies. So if you were going to be more profitable, I'm going to butcher the pig metaphor. Did you see what I did?
I did, yeah, right? It's very clever.
Right.
It's nice that you just flagged it up to us as well.
Thank you. I'm trying to be helpful.
Are you?
The pig farmer has the weight of the pig built into their business model. It's going to make them more profitable, right? So in a way, there is an argument you don't need a weighing machine as an audit mechanism. You have it as a measurement mechanism because it helps them predict their profitability. Where that metaphor helps us understand compliance is if we're injecting hormones into that pig to pull the weight up, right, that the customer doesn't want. And we have to have mechanisms. So what's the business model? Is it that hormone-free pig meat is twice as profitable? Yes. In that case, you don't have to audit in the same way, okay? So it's about building into the business model. And I like bacon.
You've butchered the pig, you can have some.
I have.
Have we got microphones, please? We have. Can we have some hands up with some questions, please? First hand up here. Could you say who you are when you get the microphone, please, and just who the question's addressed to? I'd like to get through a few questions, so perhaps everybody won't answer every question unless they're desperate.
Oliver Hurry from Manufacture 2030. Thanks for the kind plug, Steve, and thanks for the pig, Avedis, as well. That's our next marketing slogan, I think. A question for really Marco, I think. Big fans of your case study, but perhaps all can comment. How do you scale the work that you do to help you improve, your suppliers improve? Because you can't go and visit them all. You can't go and hold all of their hands. So how do you scale that improvement?
Good question. Simple question to answer. I will ask those who can to join. So what is very important in what we're doing is that we call it gauge R&R, so that we measure what we measure. We don't measure a lot, but we want everybody to do the same work in the same way so that we can compare the findings with each other and that we don't have findings which we have to guess what is the meaning. Yeah? And we are training now at this moment in time a company which is also here, and they are teaming up with us to do, for example, in those countries where I'm not present myself, but first they learn on the job together with us to do the same thing on the same methodology and everything the same, and then they go back. So we glue them to us, they take the same color, and then they go there. That's how we scale.
Next hand, please. In the middle. Can you see? Can everyone see that? There we go.
Luke Smith from Impact. I was just wondering where workers are in Beyond Compliance.
Could you say that again, please?
So where are workers in this debate?
Where are workers in this debate? Who's that to? Anyone? Anyone like to answer it? Where are workers in this debate about going beyond compliance?
Well, front and center.
Yeah,
I mean, where else would they be? And sort of that last theme, I think that I got an agreement out of Genevieve on is, again, if we get to where we are not thinking about this in terms of management and workers, because we have integrated the whole thinking throughout the organization, throughout the process, we can finally say we are where we want to be. So again, I mean, it's a good question, it's an important question, but in the question itself is the seed of the symptom of the problem. Thinking of it as a separate part, a separate piece, it has to be thought of holistically. So they have to be in front and center, just as management has to be front and center, just as customers have to be front and center. You cannot think of them as divorced from each other. Going back to Sally's point about systems thinking. And so are the pigs, by the way, right there, front and center.
Sorry, let's Genevieve first, then Marco.
Sure. Okay. I think that's an important question. I think it's a great question. One thing I would just add is that one thing I find quite exciting are the number of worker-driven social responsibility programs that are popping up. Those are programs in which brands are working directly with workers to try to solve problems like modern slavery. Tomato pickers in Florida, great example. They came together, they asked for a penny more per pound of tomatoes that they were picking, and they got shot down by the people owning and managing the farms. They then went to the brands who are consumer-facing and came to a really innovative solution with them that has its own contract, it has its own agreement directly with those brands, and as a result, workers are driving an anti-slavery program. They monitor a hotline. They have a whole infrastructure set up. And those programs have results. You can see net reductions in gender-based violence, in forced labor on the farms, in all sorts of areas. And so I think that we need to start taking those very seriously. They have real data behind them, and they are starting to be scaled to many different sectors and areas. And I think that those are really promising. So workers, for me, need to be absolutely front and center as part of the solution here.
That's a great example.
Okay. I will give a different answer to that. It's not front and center, just part of the total ecosystem. I will give you an example what we did find. And I don't know where you are, I think over there somewhere. Hi. We audited companies a lot, and we did find we had a lot of findings, and I was questioning myself, are these findings real or are they not real? So we went to a supplier of us where I thought something is not right and everything looks right, but I'm going there myself. And we got all the right answers. And I was really afraid, because when I went to the shop floor, I saw, this is strange, yeah? And what happened after that, we have trained the supplier, told the supplier, took away the risk and the hurdle that he had to take. He said, so I can send you the real records, I can show you how much time I'm doing with my people, I can show you everything. I said, yes, please do, there will be no punishment. Yeah? And when we came there, they had in their breast pockets, all the employees had little, how to call that, A5s with written five sentences in there, what to answer when an auditor is coming on social security cases. Yeah? Where is the next fire exit? It's over there. How many hours do you do? It's so much. How is your management? He is great, yeah? So all that stuff was written in a local language, of course, in his breast pocket. And I said, why are you doing that? Because after the third one, I got annoyed. I said, can we please stop that? And because there's no punishment ahead. Yeah, but I do get 50 audits a year. And if I don't answer the questions like this, I get thousands of actions. And they're all the same, but all different formats and what have you. So answering your question is easy. Yes, we have to do this for the workers, but we also have to do that for the total ecosystem, that we have one standard in which we approach them and that we accept from each other how we're working, and that openness is the key. And that's the answer to your question from my side. Yeah.
Wesley, do you want to answer briefly?
The only thing I would add to that is that I think for workers across various industries, I think the kind of dimensions of talent are changing. So as you look, whether it's retail, whether it's manufacturing, the need for talent and upskilling of talent continues to happen. And so kind of the old model of thinking of workers or labor as transactional, I mean, that is a day that is disappearing fast. And kind of the new world where workers add a kind of unique and kind of very capable contribution to the system, to what's going on, that's emerging very quickly. And so unless, as a company, unless you have kind of workers integrated into that picture in a constructive, in a proactive way, and you're able to attract the workers that you want into your environment, then you are going to be challenged as a business.
The design of our systems puts workers front and center. The unintended consequence of that design is that they are shoved into the shadows. And I'm really worried, and I think it's a really powerful question. And Marco and Genevieve have shown exactly how that happens mechanically. Genevieve's example is fantastic. I'm assuming you know about tomatoes in Florida. But that was not an action that came out of auditing, compliance, supplier or customer doing anything. And we need to make that part of the system of the management, not of the workers taking care of their own self-interest. So I do believe your question is incredibly important. We are failing to match our intention here. It's not that our intention is evil.
There's a question here, please, at the front. Oh, sorry, there and then here. Sorry. Yes.
Good afternoon. My name is Sridhar, and I serve on the board of the largest garment manufacturer in the Middle East. Rather than a question, this is more food for thought for all of us, not just the panelists. What if audit firms start moving towards trying to gain more of market share in creating compliant factories rather than just market share in the audit space? What I'm trying to say is that what if an organization like us signs up with Sedex, for example, for an end-to-end solution, and by which Sedex not just gives us the audit support, but also helps us achieve the levels of compliance, and thirdly, most importantly, underwrites the whole thing. That would be so much more easier, isn't it? Because today we are all of us are well-meaning and we are doing wonderful things, but we still haven't reached there. So what if we start looking at this kind of a solution by which a particular organization, a reputed organization, whether it is Sedex or RAP or any of the programs, provide end-to-end solution and underwrite the whole thing?
Avedis?
Well, one of my favorite aphorisms is the one that goes, in theory, there is no difference between theory and practice, but in practice, there is. I think in theory, that's a great idea. I can think of at least one major challenge in practice, which is that the model you're describing essentially suffers from one fatal flaw. From what I'm hearing, it sounds like you are having homework being given, done, and checked by the same entity or same group of entities, and that doesn't work. You cannot do your homework and have it graded too. There has to be some separation between the consulting function, which I'm hearing being described, and the audit and certification function. Otherwise, there's no credibility to that certification piece. But having said that, I think what I'm seeing happening in terms of the work RAP is doing, in terms of the work Sedex is doing, is a movement towards that idea that we are not simply taking this on as a policing function, as it were, or as a inspection function, but rather it is about, to Marco's point, and to the point I think all of us have echoed, it is about creating an environment in which we are going to foster improvement and recognize ground realities, not be bound to the old sort of comply or die approach, but rather recognize that we have much to learn from each other. So to that extent, I do think that's a great idea, and we are seeing that happen. The last and most obvious fundamental flaw from that model is the prospect of underwriting it and who is going to fund it, which is, I think, a struggle that we continue to not have a good answer for in this space. Successful efforts need to be economically sustained, and one of the challenges that I always run into is sustainability. It can often itself not be very sustainable if it is not done right. So to that extent, any model that alleviates some of that and is innovative in terms of trying to come up with ways to fund it, I'm certainly very interested in exploring further. Okay. But I don't think I have the answer for it myself.
Just quickly.
Quickly. If I would be Jonathan now, my heart would be jumping, because it's exactly what he wants out of this conference, yeah. Statements. Just to give you 2 sentences, because I was just told that I have to be quick. One, what you're saying, we have to create a standard, and that's what, Jonathan, there's your task. Thank you for that. Second of all, if you're going to execute, think about the execution. So think what you just said to the end, and then come back with the same question, and then the question gets different. So the executional part is also what I just heard, and that's exactly where it can go wrong. So yeah, you can build the foundation, and you can build all the structures around it, but think about the execution, and it has to be always rock solid, and that is where you have to think about a little bit more. Yeah? All right, so I leave it short here. Jonathan?
I'm conscious we're running out of time, so I'm just going to do 2 more questions. I've got one here. Been waiting very patiently, and them over there. I'm so sorry we haven't got time for lots more. We've already overrun.
Thank you. Thank you. Barbara Gregory with Walmart. Appreciate this morning's been very challenging thinking, especially becoming a system thinker. So as we think about this whole idea of a system, we've talked a lot about workers, facilities, audit firms, results. We haven't talked much about the retailer and how the retailer fits into the system. I have my own thoughts, but I'd like to hear thoughts from the panel.
How the retailer fits.
How does the retailer fit into the system as a system thinker and making this happen? And then the second prong goes back to the pig, which I love. Absolutely love that thought process. I like bacon too, but not from that perspective. But should we be measuring the weight of the pig? Are we measuring the right thing?
Okay. Are we measuring the right thing? And how does the retailer become part of that system as a system thinker?
So I would say two things. One, are we measuring the right thing? I'll start with that. I think the answer to that is we don't know. And I think that's where data and that's where kind of analysis and looking at data and big data actually comes in. And we have an opportunity as an industry to actually take that on and become smarter about how we measure and when we measure and what that looks like and to what end. And I think it's absolutely critical that we do. I think today largely we probably don't measure the right thing because we haven't kind of applied that rigor and we haven't had that look. In terms of the retailer's role, I'll actually go back to the last question and discussion, which is I think if you're going to see a model like the one that you were talking about emerging, that brands and retailers have to create some separation from their own kind of interests and preferences and really invest in larger systems that people can jump into and utilize to improve themselves and then have the brand or the retailer accept that. Now there's a middle ground there where I think, you know, in a lot of cases those systems probably don't meet the needs of brands and retailers today. So there's an opportunity for improvement there. But I think as you kind of see that convergence or see that coming together, hopefully you get to a space or a place where you are seeing brands and retailers getting more comfortable with adopting not just an audit, but an overall system. Really the question from the brand or the retailer becomes not did you or did you not pass this audit, but it's have you invested in the system and do you apply the system? That's really, I think, the key question, and having those systems out there and available for use by those who are in manufacturing, agriculture, and other sectors.
Last question, please.
We have many hundreds of people actually watching this session online. One question that was posed from the online team: what does the panel feel about undercover reporting by news media with factory audits? And although this is embarrassing for those involved, it's the sort of attention that can create change.
Is that for Maxine?
It has to go right to the top of the editorial chain for us to get permission to do covert recording. It's all carefully thought through, and I've never done it. There, that's my quick answer. What do you think of it?
I don't know which side of the
no, I don't either.
Of the spectrum that question
it's a very balanced question.
But I have generally, from a philosophical perspective, never found name and shame to be particularly useful. I think as we've seen the evolution of the sort of NGO space, and I'm a lawyer, I'm a big believer in free speech, and from a fundamental building block of society perspective. But if you are trying to affect change, truly the better way to do it is by incentivizing those who you want to change to then make the change you want to see happen. Naming and shaming achieves only one thing, and that is antagonizing them. And so I have never found that to be particularly useful. What is interesting is a middle trend that I'm seeing, and that is undercover reporting that is not being made public, but is being then taken to the boardrooms of these organizations to see if they can take action on it. Now, there's always a threat of it being made public to make the board really interested. So again, it comes to name and shame in the end. But I have come to this conclusion that fundamentally, if you work together, you make better progress. You make the change you want to make rather than try to do the name and shame game.
That's all we have time for, I'm afraid. Massively overrun, and I shall be fined, probably. So it seems then compliance isn't necessarily going away, but for some organisations, audits won't be the be-all and end-all, and the desire seems to be for ethical practices and sustainability to just become an intrinsic part of how business gets done, but people are impatient, and there are all sorts of disruptive technologies and social media that's pushing beyond compliance already, whether we like it or not. I'd like to thank our panel very much for taking part today, and for you for the questions, whether they were posed in the room or online. Just very briefly need to tell you, please, if you haven't already gone onto the app through the agenda and booked in for your breakout sessions this afternoon, please do. There's an extended lunch till 2:15. It's in the King George room. It's sponsored by RENA, and you'll also find there are event stands for you to visit. RENA Services is the RENA company that delivers services of classification, certification, testing and inspection to guarantee excellence to organisations in the marine, environment and energy, infrastructures, transport and logistics, quality and safety and agri-food sectors. We are very grateful for them, to their support, and for feeding us today. During lunch at 1:30, so you'll have to be quick, there is a breakout session from our sponsor, DNVGL. It's taking place on supply chain fitting for the future in the Queen Charlotte room, on the impact of digital transformation in supply chain assurance. I wish I had time to unpick that, but I don't. The afternoon session begins back here at 2:15 with an Oxford-style debate on whose responsibility is it to go beyond compliance. Eat, drink, chat. See you at 2:15. Thank you.